was just reflecting a little bit on visas because there's a lot of people who have gotten kind of like all these online entrepreneurs who've made it big, I mean, they've done something great, but I think I'm yet to find someone who really wasn't raised in like the UK or the US. And all of these guys are talking about how you can just build a company and set up your Stripe account and then do this and do that and this, that, and the other. And then you get rich and everything works. And it is such a misconception. Firstly, like there's so much, it's so much harder than I think most people make it out to be. But also, if you do not live in one of these countries, specifically America or the UK, which are huge economies, like you are immediately at a huge disadvantage. But it's not a disadvantage you can't overcome, but it's a disadvantage you have to acknowledge and you will have to work through. And it is not a reason to stop. There's one of the most recent billionaires, made all of his money. He's from Tanzania, and he built his wealth, built it like basically doing FMCG, so selling like toothpaste and stuff like that all over Africa and the Middle East, and he dominated that industry. And now he's a billionaire. He lives in Dubai, and so it's definitely possible. But I think like I've been considering this a lot because right now I'm trying to figure out some stuff for London, and I will, for the time being at least, probably not get a visa just yet. I will just be going as a tourist, but for like a relatively long stay, which is permitted. Like I'm only doing the activities permitted by law. But I think most people do not talk about this, or I have not seen this talked about in the online entrepreneur space, because there's a lot of people who want to make this work who are not from the UK, who are not from the US, and oftentimes they're not from the EU either. Now, do bear in mind, I am from Portugal. Portugal is one of the poorer countries in the EU, but it is still in the EU, and that grants certainly a lot of benefits. If you're from a place like France or Germany, immediately you already have an advantage because you have a big access to a bigger economy. And while yes, I have access to any country in the EU, you do not have direct access if you do not speak the language, right? So France, if you don't speak French, it's not going to be the same as being a total native French speaker there. And you don't, you will take some time to integrate into the culture. Same thing with Germany. If you don't speak German, like there definitely is a bigger economy that you can participate in, but there are some barriers to entry. Now you can certainly overcome those, and it's certainly a lot easier to just like learn a language or learn a culture than to figure out this whole visa thing. But those are barriers that do exist. And like right now, I was just considering a whole host of visa options, like how would I get to the UK and things like that. And I think the reality is, if you are not from one of these countries, to do the same thing as somebody else who is in, the UK, the US, whatever it is, or a lot of Commonwealth countries. I think a lot of like Canadians and Australians don't recognize the privilege that they have, because as a Canadian or an Australian, or I think even Singaporean citizen, like you have to be a passport holder. Bear in mind, I've been in Singapore a long time, but I do not hold a passport. You have access to a place like the UK. Oftentimes you have a lot of agreements and things in place with countries like the US, but the UK specifically is easier to immigrate to if you come from a Commonwealth country. So like you were previously part of the British Empire, and they kind of included you in their little circle of friends. And like I was speaking to a guy from Ethiopia the other day who called me about DevLaunch and just to chat really. And in Ethiopia, I think a lot of people, like there's Payoneer. Payoneer is really interesting. So I think that's like they're a company that's doing like payment processing in a lot of third world countries. And I think they're exploring a really interesting business opportunity to solve this gap to get people paid in these countries. But also he said what a lot of people do, or some people do in Ethiopia, is they pay, I think like, some nominal fee, like $150. Once they start making a little bit of money, they pay a fee to set up a company, like an American entity. And once they've set up that American entity, they can set up Stripe billing and stuff like that, right? So they can then bill through Stripe. But Stripe in Ethiopia does not work natively. And even though, yeah, sure, you could, like in theory, you could register an American company and then have Stripe payments, but that neglects all the complexity that it is to run a country and run a company in a country that you have never lived in, or that you don't even know how the rules work. Like that alone brings on so much complexity. Like it's hard enough, like people don't acknowledge that, but it is challenging to run a company, like from an accounting perspective. Like if you're starting from zero, if you're if you've got like friends who can help you out, like great. But oftentimes, if it's your first time doing any kind of like, it's you have to figure a lot of this stuff out, and it's not immediately obvious. And to figure out the rules of a foreign country is something else entirely. And I don't think most people recognize just how much of an advantage it is, unless you're from outside these countries. Like it is a huge advantage to be born in the UK or the US, or like just because the economies are so big, they can sustain huge companies. They have more purchasing power. That alone creates a lot more opportunity. And so if you are outside of those countries, you want to get access to them quickly. That means getting access does not just mean getting a visa. You want access via network. You want to know people there. And so even if you may not, maybe you can't move to one of these countries just yet, like when you have enough money, more options become available, right? And most countries have some kind of entrepreneur visa or some kind of investor visa if you're really rich. So if when you have money, more options are created. But until you have money, it's challenging. And if you do not have access to one of these markets, you want to position yourself such that you do. And the internet has made that possible. And that is one of the best things. And that means, like, for example, if you want to integrate into the UK market and you do not have a visa, you can, first you want to make a little bit of money however you can. Like, I think agencies are a great starter business model. For me, that's development agencies. And you can start there. And once you make a little bit of money, you can make trips to said country as a tourist. Usually tourist visas are much easier to obtain, and just start creating relationships there, and relationships that will yield, more contracts, more deals in those currencies, which are a lot stronger, a lot bigger. That's really how you start. Like, you want to participate in these largest economies. You do not want, like, that is how you can accelerate that progress, right? Because the size of an economy, if the size of an economy is too small, it cannot sustain a huge fortune. I think the smallest Tuvalu GDP. There's a country called Tuvalu, and its GDP the GDP of Tuvalu in 2022 was $59 million. That is a country's GDP, gross domestic product, of $59 million. Some people make $59 million a year. Like, the fact that one person could make more than this entire country's GDP means that, like, within this country, you could not have a billionaire. That could not exist. Like, physically, the money this country has cannot sustain a billionaire, right? Because otherwise the GDP would be way more. And so the only way a billionaire could live in Tuvalu is if they move there. But you could not create a billionaire out of Tuvalu because the country itself, the domestic economy, is not large enough to sustain that kind of fortune. And so if you are in a smaller economy and you want to accelerate, like, some kind of path to wealth, you have to be thinking, how do I participate in the bigger economies? Like, that's fundamentally, like, one of the things that you have to start thinking about, is how do at the same time, though, your economy will have less competition, so it may be easier to dominate, right? And there's also a common business model / playbook, which is copy what's working in developed economies like the UK or US, and just do it locally for yourself. Like, that is a legitimate business model that a lot of people do. And that can make you a lot of money, and it can, it can create a path for you to wealth within your own country. But I think, like, if you position yourself with access to a larger economy, that accelerates that a lot more, because what is a little bit of money there may be a lot of money in the economy where you're from. And that makes a very real impact on your living standards. And if you want to keep going, then you really have to kind of position yourself in one of those larger economies. And some places are relatively easier to move to, like Dubai. That's why you get a lot of people going there nowadays. It's a relatively straightforward visa process. And some are a little bit more complicated. So America, I think, has more complications around visas and things like that. And I think it's just important, like, if you're strategizing about, some point trying to, create some kind of wealth, you have to be thinking about these things. Yeah. Anyway, today's been a decent day. I didn't get to work much, but I went out with two friends and caught up, and that was really good. Two friends here in Singapore. Um, and I'm pretty, well, I haven't been the most productive, but I've done a lot of like strategic thinking about how do I position myself in the places that I want to be, create a day to day life that I do enjoy living. Um, I'm getting, a place in London for a little while, and I'm excited about that because it'll give me more access to that city that I want to be more of a part of, and I want to expand my access and kind of surface area in these larger cities. Um, Fundamentally, more opportunity. There's more serendipity. All those things, right? Like where you are really affects your journey. And if you do not have access by default, I think it is so important that you think about how you will someday create access for yourself. That is fundamentally some of the reflections that I've had. And you do not need to go for a visa right off the bat. You can just think about, how do I visit more? How do I create more connections in the country, whatever. And then also, like, for one of the considerations for me is I don't want to pay tax in a place like the UK, but there are options for that because you can position yourself as a non-domiciled resident, and you can keep your tax residency elsewhere. Dubai obviously is super open to a lot of international entrepreneurs. That's why you get that. But it frustrates me when I see people who preach how easy it is if you just work hard when they're born in America or something like that, because, well, definitely it's a component, like luck is a component as well. You are lucky to just simply be born in that country, and that should be recognized as such. And I think oftentimes it's not. And I think it can be discouraging because they will not acknowledge the problem that other people may face when they're, and that is a very, very real problem. Now, obviously, like, it's a huge economy, and like those people who made those, who've done it, like in those economies, are still very, like, they're worthy of their merit, right? Like they didn't build it just out of sheer luck, and it didn't just fall into their lap. You do have to work hard. You do have to make a lot of things happen, but just having access to that economy in the first place is in some way a trump card, right? And like, it's just a consideration that you should have. I still hold the belief that, like, it's very much possible to, especially with the internet, it's made it possible to go very far, even if you're not directly born. Like 100 years ago, without the internet, it's probably not, if you're born in Zimbabwe, it's probably quite hard to make it happen, because oftentimes you just lack the information, whatever. But nowadays with the internet, like, it's a much more level playing field. There's more opportunity than ever, but you have to think about these things and at some point strategize about them. But you have to also get in like, the first step is just starting to make some money, and that means you have to figure out a service that works in your country. I think Payoneer is probably the biggest in third world countries. You have things like Wise, Revolut, Stripe. Like, there's all kinds of payment processors that work in a lot of countries. You got to find one that works in your country, and think, how can I get access to bigger and bigger economies? Maybe I don't go straight to the biggest. Maybe I go to one that's like closer to my home, but still bigger. That's a really important reflection to have, and I think it's on a very case by case basis. There's no one piece of advice that I'd probably give as a fix all, like, be all end all fix it solution. But it just has to be, okay, like, if I'm in Ethiopia, I can get payments without paying. How can I get money online without paying $150 to manage and set up some company? That's going to be a lot of work. So how can I avoid that? Maybe I can do Payoneer. All right, Payoneer works. Let's connect that to the bank account. All right, just start doing something online and getting some money in. Maybe that's Fiverr, whatever it is. There's plenty of ways to go about it, but then you get the ball rolling, and then you want to upgrade. Okay, how can I set up a company somewhere? So if you have like $10,000, you could go straight for a company in Dubai. That would be the ideal situation, but maybe that's not possible. You can set up an Estonian company, for example. So you can set up a company in Estonia and see if that's possible without necessarily a residential address. Okay, maybe Estonia needs an EU like residency. Okay, where else can I, like, you have to Google these things, and I don't have all the answers, but you have to find where can you, like, once you have a little bit of money, where can you set up a company that can take a little bit more money in, right? So um like that can start to sustain you. And then how do you then, okay, like maybe I have a small registered company, like it's just where are the places that you have access to? You have to be thinking about those things, and you know where you position yourself will also affect your taxes and things like that. And I think that's an important thing to think about. But that's probably a conversation for another day. At the minute, it is just 15 minutes past midnight, and I'm gonna go ahead and sleep in a bit and work tomorrow morning like 8 a.m. So that's the plan.